It's unusual for the police to know the name of a serial killer, but be unable to apprehend them. But it does happen. In this video, we'll be taking a look at 3 serial killers who were either named or very accurately described, but simply disappeared after committing their crimes, never to be heard from again. Where are they, you ask? Well, it's a very good question, and one that cannot be answered. Elmer Crawford. In 1971, the suburb of Glenroy in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia was in shock after 4 members of the Crawford family were found dead at the bottom of a cliff at Loch Ard Gorge in Port Campbell. They were identified as Therese Crawford, who was pregnant, and her 3 children, Catherine Jane, aged 12, James William, aged 8, and Karen Jean, aged 6. The bodies were found wrapped in blankets inside the family car that had a hose from the exhaust to the driver's side window in an attempt to make their deaths look like a murder-suicide. However, when the police broke into the Crawford family home, they discovered evidence of a particularly cruel murder. A long electrical cord with alligator clips attached was found, and police believed the murderer attached the clips to Teresa's ears and electrocuted her while she slept. After murdering Teresa, the killer battered the children to death with a blunt instrument, probably a hammer. There were also signs that someone had tried to clean up the murder scene. The victims were then put in the family car and driven hundreds of miles to the cliff top at Loch Ard Gorge. The killer intended for the car and the bodies to plunge into the sea. However, the car got lodged on a ledge 20 meters from the cliff top. As Elmer Crawford, husband of Teresa Crawford and father to all 3 children, was nowhere to be found, he became the number 1 suspect. A subsequent inquest into the deaths concluded that Elmer was responsible for murdering his family, and to this day remains one of Australia's most wanted men. However, the then 41-year-old has never been seen again, despite numerous reported sightings in Australia and elsewhere over the past 53 years. A reported sighting in Western Australia in 1994 was deemed credible by police, but they never managed to track the man down. In 2005, it was thought that a body in a morgue in Texas was Crawford, and facial recognition technology confirmed it was a possible match. Hopes were further raised when it was reported that the dead man had removed his fingerprints in what looked like a concerted effort to conceal his identity. However, 5 years later, a blood relative of Crawford was discovered in New South Wales, and her DNA evidence proved that the man in the Texas morgue was not in fact Crawford. It's highly likely that Elmer is dead, but even so, the investigation is still active, and detectives in Victoria are still hopeful that they will track down the man who killed his entire family and disappeared all those years later, either dead or alive. Bible John. In the late 1960s, there was a spat of murders in the Glasgow area of Scotland. Patricia Docker, Jemima MacDonald and Helen Puttock were all believed to have been murdered by the same man. Each of the young women were mothers who had gone for a night out at Glasgow's Barrowland Ballroom, leaving their children at home in the care of family members. None of them returned home. All 3 were strangled and their bodies dumped just a short distance from where they lived. The murders caused fear amongst young women in Glasgow, who were convinced there was a serial killer on the loose, and the search for the perpetrator led to Scotland's biggest manhunt. His 3rd victim, Helen Puttock, was not only his last victim, but her murder offered the most clues, with a clear description and a name of the man who killed her. On the night before Helen was killed, she had gone to the Barrowlands Ballroom with her sister Jean. That evening, Helen was wearing a new black dress she had bought earlier in the day, and according to her sister, she looked lovely that night. Helen had 2 children from her marriage to George Puttock, a Lance Corporal in the Royal Corps of Signals. However, the marriage broke down, and Helen returned to Glasgow and lived with her mother in Earl Street. At the ballroom, both women became acquainted with separate men. both of who gave their names as John. In the early hours of the 31st of October 1969, Jean and Helen left the ballroom with the two men. Jean's dance partner left and boarded a bus, while Jean, Helen and the other John got in a taxi. During the taxi drive, Jean later recalled the conversation with John, saying he was very well spoken and had strong views on married women going to Barrowland, calling it an adulterous den of iniquity. The man also said he once worked in a laboratory and was familiar with Glasgow. He also repeatedly quoted from the Old Testament stories of Moses and mentioned he didn't drink alcohol. Jean also got the feeling he didn't want her in the taxi with him and Helen. After Jean was dropped at her home, Helen stayed in the taxi as it headed towards her home, but sadly never made it. The next morning, a man walking his dog stumbled upon the partially naked body of 29-year-old Helen. Her badly beaten body was beside a drain pipe in the back garden of her Earl Street flat. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death with one of her stockings. Her handbag had been emptied but was missing. It was clear Helen had made a desperate attempt to fight her attacker off. As has been the case with the two previous victims, Helen had been menstruating at the time of her death, and her murderer had placed a sanitary towel beneath her left arm. Jean was a crucial witness and told all she could about the man. She believed his name was John Templeton, John Sempleson, or John Emerson. He was well dressed in a smart suit and was slim, tall, and smoked embassy cigarettes. He also had an overlapping front tooth. Following Jean's description of the man, a bus driver and his conductor came forward and believed they had seen the same man at the junction of Dumbarton Road and Grey Street at around 2 a.m. on the 31st of October. The man appeared dishevelled with mud stains on his jacket and a red mark below one eye. Both witnesses also noticed him repeatedly tucking one sleeve into his jacket sleeve. This is significant as a cufflink was found at Helen's murder scene. The same man was last seen walking towards the public ferry to cross the River Clyde to the south side of the city before disappearing. When the press got hold of the details Jean had provided, the name Bible John was used to describe the murderer. More than 5,000 people were interviewed, and the inquiry saw the first use of a police photo fit of the suspect. But no arrests were made. Although one suspect's body was exhumed after the case was reopened in 1995, but he was eliminated after tests failed to find any DNA linked to the killings. Over the years, there have been many suspects and talk of a police cover-up, but ultimately, over 5 decades later, the case remains unsolved. It was almost certainly the man in the taxi with Helen who disappeared into the night, never to be apprehended. Xavier Pierre Marie Dupont de Ligonnès. Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès, his wife Agnes and their 4 children, Annie, Arthur, Thomas and Benoit, appeared to be the perfect French family. Xavier and his wife got married in the 1980s, and he took on her 2-year-old son Arthur as his own. Despite Javier's family being part of the French aristocracy, the family lived in a modest house at 55 Boulevard Robert Schumann in Nantes, France. Xavier worked as a salesman after several of his business ventures failed, while Agnes worked as an assistant at a Catholic school in Nantes. However, it seemed that life was not as rosy as everyone thought. Xavier was in terrible debt that threatened his family's way of life. This is the series of events that led to the family's demise. On April 1st, 2011, 20-year-old Arthur left St. Gabriel Private College and did not show up at the pizzeria where he worked. This was completely out of character for him. The next day, Xavier visited several different local shops and brought cement, a shovel and a hoe. He also purchased 4 10-kilogram bags of lime. On Sunday, April 3rd, a neighbour saw Agnes and later witnessed Xavier putting large bags into his Citroën C5 car. Later that evening, Xavier, Agnes, Annie, Arthur and Benoit ate at a local restaurant and went to the cinema. A couple of days later, Xavier had dinner with 18-year-old Thomas after asking him to return home from a friend's place, claiming that his mother had been in an accident. It's believed at this point that Xavier had already killed Agnes and his 3 other children. On the same day, a bailiff arrived at the home to recover a debt of €20,000, but no one answered the door. It is thought that sometime between the 3rd and 5th of April, Xavier killed his wife, his 4 children, and the family's 2 pet dogs. Over the days that followed, he sent cryptic emails to friends, and to his immediate family, he sent a detailed letter explaining that after having worked covertly for the US Drug Enforcement Administration, the entire family has had to relocate to the United States as part of a federal witness protection program, and that no one will be able to contact them for a few years. On April 11th, a concerned family and neighbour called the police after noticing no activity at the Crawfords' usually busy home. 2 days later, they arrived and checked the house, but found nothing untoward and believed the family had left voluntarily. The police continued to visit the family home, but on each occasion found nothing suspicious. It wasn't until their 6th visit on April 21st that they found something odd under the terrace in the garden. After digging, they found a grave containing the bodies of Agnes, Arthur, Benoit and Annie. The 2 dogs were also buried there together with a crucifix. The body of Thomas was found in a separate grave. As Xavier's body was not found, the police considered him the prime suspect. An autopsy concluded Agnes was first killed, followed by the children who had been drugged. All 4 of them had been shot twice in the head whilst they slept, with a .22 long rifle that was fitted with a silencer. The murders were considered to be systematic executions. However, strangely, there was no trace of blood anywhere in the house, and police were puzzled as to how someone could kill 5 people in a home and leave no trace of evidence behind. In fact, investigators found no fingerprints or DNA from anyone, and there was no physical proof implicating Xavier. Despite the lack of physical evidence, the hunt was on to find Xavier. They established he had left the area and stayed at various hotels, where he was captured on film by surveillance camera. At one hotel, he left his car in the car park and was seen carrying a bag with a long object in it, which may well have been the rifle used in the murders. Investigators conducted massive searches of the areas where Xavier was last seen, but no trace of him has ever been found, prompting many to believe he committed suicide in some isolated cave in the mountains of southern France. However, a curious thing did happen in July 2015, when a journalist in Nantes was sent a photograph of Arthur and Benoit. On the back was written a simple note, "I'm still alive." So if he is, then where is he? In a strange twist to the case, external family members believe that the entire family is still alive. They question why the bodies were cremated so quickly, and they weren't allowed to see them, and also why no DNA tests were done to establish if all the victims were related. It has even been suggested the bodies were planted. It's also claimed that Xavier had a bad back and would not have been physically able to dig the graves the bodies were found in. Another curious thing is that Xavier didn't cover his tracks after the murders. He withdrew money from his bank card and was recorded on security cameras without any effort to cover his face or hide his identity. He also ate out in several restaurants. So the question is, where is Xavier? Who killed the family? Or are they still alive? And was Xavier really working for the US Drug Enforcement Administration? We'd love to hear your thoughts and theories on this one in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.